Dr. Jessica White is a Senior Research Fellow in the Terrorism and Conflict Group at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Her research focuses on gender mainstreaming strategies for countering terrorism and violent extremism policy and programming. And this, of course, includes her book that we will be discussing today. She has over a decade's worth of experience as a researcher and a security practitioner with a prior career in the US military. Jessica has also acted as a gender advisor on multiple projects, including for the European Union, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the United Nations. So, thank you so much, Jessica, for making the time to be with us and for telling us about this amazing and incredibly relevant book. Thank you. I'll pass the floor over.
Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me today. I'm really pleased to speak with you all, and as Giovanna said, I'm really happy for everyone to sort of engage in the conversation. Feel free to interrupt if it's relevant to what we're talking about. If I know I'm going to come back to it later, then I'll just tell you that. We can come back to it later with your comments and questions. I will just warn you that I did think through this morning, and I added in a few slides from sort of where we've carried the work forward as well. So hopefully there's not duplicates in there now, but I think it would be interesting to sort of also we can discuss some of the work that I've been doing sort of as gender advisors on projects since I wrote the book. That might be pertinent or useful information to your work as well. So let me just share now. All right. Can everyone see that? Is that visible?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so this book obviously is entitled Gender Mainstreaming. It's about gender mainstreaming. It's sort of a project of my PhD research, so several years of study full-time at university. And then following that, I became a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, which is one of the case studies that went into the book, and became the gender advisor on some of the preventing and countering violent extremism program that they are working on, which allowed me to sort of update it with a little bit of, I think, insider knowledge that perhaps is not so easily available to everyone else. So the book really follows the trajectory of learning about gender mainstreaming that has gone on over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And it really is interesting to see how much has progressed, how much the conversation has progressed, where it's progressed, where it's perhaps not progressed as much as we hoped it would. Yeah, so let me explain a little bit, I think, first the context of what it does, what the book tries to do. Essentially, I think to simplify, it tries to look at the big picture lens, sort of look at the space of counterterrorism, the conflicts related to counterterrorism that were happening and are happening still today, and how it's shaped what we think of as gender mainstreaming today, and then it narrows in and focuses more on what a gender mainstreaming approach or strategy can actually look like for a preventing and countering violent extremism program. I did look, for the book, I looked specifically at PCVE programs. I'm going to use that acronym now. I hope that's a familiar acronym to everyone, but Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism Program, PCVE program. I chose to use PCVE because I think a lot of the conversation around whether we should call it only PVE or only CVE came up while I was working on the book. So I did use PCVE as the acronym in the book, but the book focuses largely on PCVE program examples. However, as Giovanna said in my introduction, I am former military, and I do actually work with the military, trained military on sort of hard security, gender mainstreaming efforts as well. So I think a lot of it is applicable across sort of harder and softer approaches to gender mainstreaming in the counterterrorism space. Essentially, I started with the big picture. So thinking about some of the challenges, I think, for gender mainstreaming, it really became apparent to me that this evolution of CVE or PCVE as part of the prevention pillar of a counterterrorism framework really impacted the way that we thought about gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming started, I think the first time it was ever used was in 1997 in the sort of UN economic and social policy, started, as the effort to encourage or achieve a status of gender equality within policy. And sort of that goal of gender equality somewhat gets lost, I think, often within gender mainstreaming. It can become this effort of counting numbers of women and all these different things that we can get into to discuss today. But I think sort of that evolution of where it started in 1997, how it became part of the sort of women's empowerment focus, and then how it filtered into the counterterrorism agenda as part of the women, peace, and security agenda, it really impacted how we think about gender mainstreaming and how sort of is a legacy of perhaps some of the challenges that we face today still with, are we talking about women? Are we talking about everyone? What does it apply to? Who does it apply to? So I think that evolution process is really important to what we think of as gender mainstreaming expectations. Yeah, so I think maybe to give a little bit of context to this, for the book itself, I looked at 4 case studies of PCVE programs, and I looked at them, compared them basically across 4 different levels. So I looked at different institutions that were implementing these large institutions. So the European Union was funding 2 of them in the end. The UN Women funded and implemented one in partnership with country donors, and then the 3rd one was implemented by the United States, the USAID. So I looked across the institutional sort of approaches and institutional levels of commitment, I would say, to gender mainstreaming. I looked across sort of time. So, one of them started in 2014, which was still at the very early stages of learning about what we need about gender mainstreaming and PCVE. The most recent one sort of ended in 2021. So it was definitely across a period of time and learning that happened over that time. And then I looked across sort of different advertised approaches to what gender mainstreaming should mean. Yes, so some of them, said, look, we're taking a gender blind approach. Some of them said, look, we're going to take a gender sensitive approach, and we can come back to what those terms mean. But essentially, they were suggesting that they were approaching it from different perspectives. So I looked across those perspectives as well, and that's sort of how I came to some of these conclusions that I'll explain here in the next few slides. So I think one of the big things that has impacted what we talk about with gender mainstreaming, what we mean by gender mainstreaming, is sort of the focus of the last 2 decades of counterterrorism on the threat of Islamist extremism and on the sort of the conflicts happening in the Middle East, and sort of it shapes how the counterterrorism framework itself has been built up, has been framed, has been sort of focused. And in that, it has also shaped how gender mainstreaming has become a part of that conversation. I would argue that it also, that context of that focus on that part of the world, on that specific threat, has also shaped the development of the women, peace, and security agenda. I don't know if probably everyone is familiar with the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda. Started in 2000, has been 10 sort of progressive agenda. Our Security Council resolutions have followed that over the time, sort of with the focus on including women in peace and security solutions. Also a focus on accounting for how conflict and how counterterrorism impacts them differently than it does others, on the need to consider that impact as part of operations. And then in more recent years, also how they can be part of a terrorist threat, how we need to think about them in the focus on, to return foreign terrorist fighters, as they're called. So it sort of has evolved. The Women, Peace, and Security agenda has evolved in parallel to this counterterrorism focus, which has impacted, I think, the focus of the agenda itself, because that is what was part of, the primary conversation happening in the political arena at the time. It shaped what people were willing to talk about and maybe what they were less willing to talk about. And I would argue that that's probably why it's called the Women, Peace, and Security agenda rather than the gender peace and security agenda. And that was sort of the sticking point in the big picture of the struggle of, I think, people who are trying to do gender mainstreaming now, is that gender mainstreaming ultimately is about gender and not about women, I would certainly argue. When I say gender, what I mean is sort of those socially, culturally derived expectations of people and the roles that they should take in life based upon their sexual identity. So it's about that social expectation. And accounting for how that impacts then maybe why people get involved in terrorism, how they get involved in violent extremism, how we can appeal to them to disengage, to, all these different elements are impacted by people's gender role expectations in society. So I very much, talk about the empowerment of women needing to be one element of a gender mainstreaming strategy. However, I would argue that it is only one element of what needs to be a much wider strategy, looking at how gender role factors are impacting every individual and how they actually, we'll get onto this, how they sort of impact the institutions themselves and the institutional actions that happen. So it's a little bit of a challenge because it's called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And often I'm still at the point in conversations where I'm explaining why I am not just talking about women. We're talking about a whole range of the whole range of people involved in these types of programs, and these types of counterterrorism actions. So that, I think, is one element of it. Another element of it that I, in the big picture, sort of looking at, I thought that led to some of the challenges around what we mean by gender mainstreaming and how it's being implemented is the issue of security frameworks themselves. So I'm coming from the hard security space. I'm very familiar with sort of operational strategic goals in the hard security space. And I thought this might be quite pertinent to quite a few of your roles. But the thinking about sort of what state security goals are versus human security aims. And I think this is often where governments get caught out in sort of there's a lot of high level agreements to, yes, we think we should be gender mainstreaming everything. Yes, we think, women should be considered. Yes, we agree that all of these are elements that, we have agreed to, that they're in the policy, they're written. There's goals in place to achieve these elements, but there's still today a huge gap between what is being said at that really high level of agreement. Yes, okay. And what is actually happening on the ground and how people are thinking about doing this on the ground, how we're actually practically implementing it, what it means, how to do it, how to get buy-in to doing it. And I think a lot of that has to do with this gap we see between what a state security goal looks like and what a human security goal looks like. I added in another slide here just to go into this a little more detail. I think it might be useful. Please, somebody, jump in if this is not clear, or if there's any questions around this. But essentially, in the first couple chapters of the book, I talk a lot about this element of state security goals, nation states. They all participate in the history of the international political arena is very much grounded in this realist sense of state security. And historically, in that tradition, men were the only citizens of the state. They were the ones that were able to physically fight for, defend the state. Women actually weren't even considered citizens of the state in the history of the realist tradition of international politics. So you see how it's ingrained in sort of the way that these institutions were created and the ways that the rules around interaction in the international space, political arena has been ingrained with this sense of male domination, because men were considered the sort of political actors, the military actors, the security actors, and then state goals that then follow with that. State security goals are often this reduction of immediate threat, right, to the state, reduction of threat from foreign governments, from foreign domestic terrorist actors, but that is at protection of the state level. So to reduce the immediate threat of attack upon citizens or assets of the state. To reduce drivers of conflict that might lead to a future threat to the state. Those are sort of those state security goals that dominate often the hard counterterrorism space, right? When military action is taking place, the state security goals are what they are trying to achieve. Whereas human security goals are often, if you look at the language of prevention and countering violent extremism programming, it has the language of human security goals, right? It has the language of wanting to understand at the community level and at the individual level what is making communities and individuals insecure, and addressing those drivers of extremism from a much more granular level. And I think that sort of addressing the underlying drivers of conflict language has influenced what people think we mean by gender mainstreaming. It's often considered more common or more commonly popular in that sort of softer side of counterterrorism, because it's associated with this sort of thinking about women, what women are, what makes women insecure, how to make them more secure. But I would definitely argue, and I do argue in the book, that we need to sort of think about reorienting hard and soft security to consider from a human security perspective, sort of how individuals and states in the globalized world are functioning much differently. Nation state divisions and considerations have become blurred in the globalized, modern world. So we really have to think about human security, even at the military sort of hard security level, and think about how all of counterterrorism needs to consider what is making individuals insecure. And in that, every individual has to be considered, right? So women have to be considered, men have to be considered, disabled people have to be considered. All these different identity markers have to be considered when you're trying to think about what makes humans at an individual level insecure. So a lot of the first couple of chapters talk about this, and I see a couple of hands went up and down. So if anyone wants to jump in, please do.
Go ahead, Galina.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. Question. I am from W&D background more, and we have a lot of talk about gender mainstreaming there as well. And like the human security as well, like human disarmament or something like that. So I was wondering, in our case, we now promote a lot this like humanitarian consequences of those weapons. So we tell like individual stories, and this is how we try to promote this. So I was just wondering how it goes in counterterrorism. Is it the same or a little bit different?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that I think I use a similar approach when I'm speaking to a military officer crowd, because they say to me, why should we worry about this? It seems outside of their realm of responsibility often to them. But I think I also use that tactic of sort of explaining, okay, if you think about a military operation, for example, a counterterrorism, military operation, where you're going as a foreign military force into a place to secure that from terrorist threats, then we could use Afghanistan for an example, right? The US military went into Afghanistan without really understanding the context of Afghanistan, without really understanding the local on the ground challenges. And in that, for example, if they went to secure a road, let's say they wanted to secure this road because they wanted, safe passage for people to go through. So I use this example all the time. They secure the road, they put up a cordon, they barrier it off so that there isn't a terrorist threat to people moving on that road. But in that, they haven't thought about the fact that perhaps the women of the local village on this side of the road have to go to that side of the road to get water out of the well every day, right? So now that they've set up their military barrier, then the women have to go all the way around to get to the well on the other side, which then puts them actually individually in more danger, because now they have to go further and there's threats perhaps from, people or animals or whatever it might be, so that now they're in more danger individually. Their community is up, is thrown off because they have to go further. They're, presented with more dangers to get to the well and to get back. So while the military has thought, okay, yeah, we did a great job, making this road safe from terrorist threats, and perhaps that helps, people travel to the central city, whatever, in a more safe way, they haven't thought about what impact their operation had on the local community right here that has to then do something that puts them in more danger. So I think in that way, that's probably similar to what you're talking about, of using those examples of human impact of the weapons and sort of helping militaries to think about in their counterterrorism operations, what is the impact on the ground of that operation and how does that need to be factored in? Because ultimately, there's a good argument to say, they went into Afghanistan, right? And maybe they secured the immediate threat to the states. Maybe they reduced the level of threat of immediate attack. But in so doing, if not done in a way that is sensitive to the local population, they've also created the next generation of terrorist threat, right? Because they've fueled the fire of what is being taught to the younger generation about this military occupying force, and is potentially encouraging a future threat that they haven't considered in their current military operation. So I think it's certainly about telling those stories, about encouraging. Probably the security sector is very focused. It's very goal focused, or goal oriented, in that they have strategic level goals, they have operational level goals, they want to get to that goal, and they don't necessarily always think about the context of what's happening in the course of getting to that goal. And I think encouraging that thinking about the context can really help, like you're saying, to consider these human security elements versus state security goals. So yes, I think it is starting to happen. It has not traditionally been a part of the conversation, but I do think there is a shift now to starting to think about that as part of the sort of harder security conversations.
Yeah, thanks. That's super interesting.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think this talk about sort of goals and impacts has definitely become part of the discussion. I hope it's becoming part of the discussion about gender mainstreaming in the counterterrorism space. Like I was saying, sort of part of the book is about the formation of the security institutions and the sort of the entrenched gender blindness and resistance to sort of gender equality in those institutions. And I would argue that ultimately, governments can sign up and say, yes, we agree to gender mainstreaming. The military sign up and say, yes, we agree to gender mainstreaming. There's a lot of agreement, but until we think inwards about the institutions, the security institutions that exist, that the policies and the programs that are implemented by them will always struggle to be meaningfully gender mainstreamed, because the institutions themselves have not considered internally what that means to them. And sort of the gender inequalities that are so prevalent in security institutions will continue to reduce the effectiveness of gender mainstreaming in PCVE programs or counterterrorism programs that those institutions might be implementing, or operations that they might be implementing. So I'm definitely a campaigner for thinking or asking institutions to think internally, to look inwards before they start trying to do, or as they're doing this outward focus of gender mainstreaming, to really consider how the gender inequalities in their own houses are impacting the effectiveness of any policy or strategy that they might be implementing outwards to partners or in foreign places. Yeah, we can come back to this if there's sort of anything that comes out of that. So looking at that big picture is sort of the first part of the book. Also looking at how the evolution of PCD has come into counterterrorism as, sort of a response to, okay, they realized that hard counterterrorism by itself wasn't making things more secure, right? They could do it, they could secure a location from immediate threat, but it wasn't addressing what was driving the threat at the lower levels. I'm sure all of you have already had these conversations many times, but PCVE was added in as sort of that preventative pillar, and then gender mainstreaming has often been aligned with sort of that PCVE part of the pillar. There's another element of looking in the book at sort of how there are commitments to PCVE that seem to want to address these, massive levels of underlying drivers, right? So you might talk about the social drivers that are happening, the inequalities that are present in society that could drive violent extremism in a local context. It might be human rights abuses or gender inequalities or, bad governance, sort of all of these huge factors. Then you talk about individual incentives, you talk about, push and pull factors for why people get involved in violent extremism. And there's a lot of talk about these very huge issues. Gender inequality is a deeply, deeply ingrained social issue. And yet PCVE programs are often 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, and they have limited budgets, limited scope. And there's a real mismatch, I argue, between sort of definitionally what you think what you're suggesting that PCVE programs are going to address and what is actually possible to address and sort of the scope that is allowed to them, the budgets that are allowed to them, the time that is allowed to them. Gender inequalities cannot be addressed in a year with $600. It can't be addressed in this sort of piecemeal fashion that often PCVE programs have taken. There is, of course, associated programming. We did talk about whether we should connect development programming more closely, or educational programming, or vocational training, all of these elements. And there's a lot of argument about the pros and cons of doing that, of connecting them to a more securitized agenda of PCVE. But there is certainly an element of PCVE can't do what it's intended to do because it is not comprehensive enough to address deep-seated inequalities that might be feeding why violent extremism is, flourishing in a certain context. And I think the core piece of gender mainstreaming that I try to emphasize throughout the book is that gender mainstreaming is important because ultimately gender inequality itself drives violent extremism, right? So I'm obviously a fan of having more women present in the counterterrorism space. I'm a fan of empowering women to help prevent and counter violent extremism. I am a fan of all of these elements that need to feed into better understanding a situation with gendered analysis and with understanding sort of what the dynamics are at the local context level. But ultimately, the argument that I base my argument for gender mainstreaming on is that if you don't address gender inequality, you are leaving one of those core drivers of violent extremism present in society. And until we start thinking about it not as some additional thing that would be great if we did a gender mainstreaming strategy because, somebody committed to it at the government level, so we should do it, but rather as an integral part of the goals of the program, I think that really, until we get to this thinking about it as an integral part, it will consistently continue to be something that is sort of halfway done a lot of the time. I've now been the gender advisor on several programs since I, started working on this topic in this space, and often I'm added in sort of halfway through something, where it's already been designed, it's already going, and trying to backfill gender mainstreaming into something is a really difficult, if not impossible, task in many ways. It's great to get what we can, where we can, how we can, but ultimately it's still often not being considered as sort of one of these core components that needs to be thought about and addressed as part of programming. So I think sort of the second part of the book then takes this closer, deeper dive look at what gender mainstreaming means, what does it mean in a PCV context, what am I even talking about? How should we do it? These are questions that I get a lot of still. So I think there are some elements here I'll just go through quickly, hopefully not too quickly. Obviously, if anyone has any questions, please jump in. But the first thing I am always, saying sort of that a gender mainstreaming strategy has to be comprehensive. It's not just one element, it's multiple elements. And I have another slide of all the elements that it can contain, but the first sort of key thing that I think often is forgotten is that it's not an additional strategy. It's something that has to be done throughout the design, throughout the implementation, throughout the monitoring and evaluation of a program. We need to have a gender analysis, right? We need to have a gendered understanding of, in the local context, what are the gender dynamics? What are the gender inequalities? How do they feed into violent extremist narratives? How do they feed into how people are being recruited, or where they're being recruited, or why they're being recruited? How do they feed into the roles that they take up in these, violent extremist organizations? How do they feed into the roles that people play in PCVE? How do they feed into the team dynamics that you might have on your team that is implementing a PCVE program? So there's so many elements that we need to understand with that gender analysis lens. And I know there's language, so this language often, I think, people get confused and get lost even at the basis of this language, but we've moved through terminology of gender blind is sort of like that, not even considering the gender dynamics, right? There's gender sensitive, and that was the first sort of move towards, okay, we need to be sensitive to the fact, we need to be aware of the fact that there are gendered differences, gendered inequalities, gendered impacts that we need to consider. Then there was the sort of gender responsive, the language of gender responsivity, so that you have to ensure that your program or your policy is responding to the gender inequalities that are present in your context. So that suggests that you understand what the gender inequalities are and what you need to respond to. And now we've come to a lot of this language of gender transformative. So, and that sort of indicates that you are then seeking to transform the gender inequalities where you are working with your program. That's a bigger sort of commitment then at that level with that language. That you are focusing your program on transforming those inequalities. And that is often associated with the language of intersectionality. And I don't know if that term is familiar to everyone here. I would assume it probably is. But intersectionality being that we have to consider the gender inequalities, but we also have to consider how they interact with racial inequalities or socioeconomic inequalities or all these different inequalities that might exist in a person's life that might be impacting their identity. So intersectionality is considering multiple identities that people hold and not thinking about them just one by one, which I am a huge proponent of. I talk about gender a lot, but I definitely think it's important that we think about how gendered identities interact with other identities people hold. So that sort of element of gendered language has evolved in policy, and it's evolved in the way that countries and governments talk about it at the high level. It's not evolving on the ground. The language may be changing, but practice is practically not changing, I would say, mostly on the grounds. And that has a lot to do with these elements of there's not enough time, there's not enough understanding of what needs to be happening, there's not enough support, monetary or knowledge support for people working on the ground to really grasp how to do this in an effective way, or how to do what they can and how to decide what's possible and what's not in the local context. I think there's also an element of a gap in the knowledge base, right? So we have academics that are learning about this and writing about it. There's a huge long literature of talking about gender mainstreaming and gender and international governance and how this feeds into security problems. But that is often a completely separate conversation to what's happening with like practitioner knowledge on the ground, learning that's happening because something works and something doesn't in a program that's being implemented in Nairobi, Kenya, or wherever it might be. Those two conversations need to work together. That's something that I argue for all the time. Sort of, there's a gap, and they because this one is saying, look, until you look at the academics are saying, look, until you look at the big picture of gender inequality, nothing will ever change. The practitioners are saying we're doing the best we can. We're trying to make a difference on the ground with the people that we're working with, but we can't do everything. Until these two start talking to each other and finding a middle ground, then we will continue to be sort of at odds, I think, in this conversation about how to make gender mainstreaming efforts more effective. This is sort of what I would talk about if I was going into detail of what I think a gender mainstreaming strategy should think about. Firstly, gender not being women. We've already talked about that. Gender as a socially constructed concept. We've talked about that. But thinking about that as a lens, this is an example that I use a lot. Youth is a common category, right? We hear about people talk about youth all the time when you talk about PCVE. And, I would say a good majority of PCVE programming is aimed at youth. And if you look at the language of evaluations, if you look at the language of, monitoring plans or design plans, youth is often left at youth. What does that mean? Are we talking about a certain age group? Are we talking about male youth? Are we talking about female youth? Are we accounting for the differences and experiences that youth might be having if they're female or if they're male, or if they're LGBTQ plus in their local, cultural context? Those elements of further analysis are often left out, and that is a failure of programs, I would say. Sort of those types of considerations have to happen, and sort of that gender lens has to happen to really understand who we're talking about, why we're targeting, why we're thinking about them as the group that needs to be addressing with this program, and what we're trying to do for them, what changes we're trying to make for their lives. Thinking about sort of the intersectionality with other identity markers, thinking about the institutions that exist in society. So, for example, we worked on a program in Kenya, and there was this dynamic of, in the local context, there were many more male youth that were of concern than female youth. So there was a mentorship program that was being implemented, and there was 70–80% male participants versus like a very small minority, 20–30%, whatever it was, of female participants. And I, had a discussion with the component lead on that part of the program. I said, why? Why is there more male participants? Why? What was the process that led to this? And some of the response was, well, men are they're more violent. In this context, we're more concerned about the male youth. And there's part of that inherent assumption, I think, in a lot of PCVE and a lot of counterterrorism, that is recycling this sort of assumption about people, that men are more violent, women are more peaceful, whereas not really digging into the local context and thinking about, okay, why would it appear that men are more violent? So is it because they're being raised, with the male sort of expectation that they provide for their family? So then they're more likely to get involved in criminal activity if they can't provide for their family, or if they feel that is the best way to provide for their family. Is that then, expose them to more violent extremist organization recruitment tactics because they're already involved in, some a gang or a peer group that might be exposed to that? Or institutionally, perhaps the men go to the mosque on Friday, and on Friday, women aren't allowed in the mosque. And on Friday, when only the men are in the mosque, there might be an imam that is preaching a more extreme version of Islam. So then the men are being exposed to a message that the women aren't being exposed to because of the gender dynamics of participation in the mosque on a Friday. And there was sort of not those granular considerations about the institutions, the places that people go, the people that they meet, why all that might be impacted by the sort of gender dynamics of the local cultural context. So there's a level of digging deeper into these assumptions around, who we're trying to target with PCVE, why we're targeting them, why they present as threats, how it is that they're getting to that sort of concern area. And I think gender mainstreaming helps us to consider those elements. There's an element of sort of the gendered essentialisms, like I'm talking about. So when I say gendered essentialisms, I'm talking about this, this assumption that men are more violent, women are more peaceful. That assumption is being made often about the people that we're working with, PCVE practitioners are working with. It's also an assumption that's often made about why you recruit people to be on your PCVE team, right? So I've heard many times in the recruitment of partner organizations, so it might be that the UN is funding, or UN Women is funding a program, but then they recruit partner organizations on the ground that are actually implementing many of the local components. Unless time and money and effort is put into ensuring at that recruitment stage that you are recruiting partners that hold that same thinking about gender mainstreaming as you do, then you might be recruiting partners that hold the assumption that, okay, we're gonna ask women to be a part of this program because they're more peaceful. So we're gonna put them in this peace building role, assuming that they're going to be good at it. And that one makes an assumption that all women are good at that, which I would say probably not. And two, it robs the women that are good at that of the recognition that they're due for being good at that, for the skill that they have developed to be good at that. And it robs the men who are good at that of the opportunity to sit in that role. So I think often we are recycling these gender assumptions or essentialisms as part of the implementation element as well. And there's care needs to be taken not to do that, to think through that. And then sort of this element of empowerment of women isn't enough. That's what I say. It's key, but it's not enough, right? Equality is the key, or equity. We can have that conversation about equity versus equality, but both of them being part of this, that is the end goal of gender mainstreaming, is that state of equality and equity. It's not just about adding in more women, increasing the numbers of women present. It's about reaching that equal. So it's about sharing equally the goals of security, about sharing equally the end goal that we're trying to get to. And the pressures and the challenges and the opportunities of reaching that goal across everyone. All right, everyone running a little bit short on time. So this is probably somewhat repetitive. This is sort of some of the more, like I said, since I've written the book, I've been acting as a gender advisor on some of these programs, and certainly learning is still developing about all the different elements that need to be considered as part of a gender mainstreaming strategy. I will tell you, as somebody who's doing it practically on the ground, it is more difficult than it sounds, right? It's something that really takes commitment to. It's something that, while, you know, myself and my team might be committed to gender mainstreaming, often if you're not considering it every step of the way, sort of who you're recruiting to be component leads, how you're designing your components, how you're designing your monitoring and evaluation framework, if it's not being implemented throughout all these stages, it makes it very difficult to carry it forward in a comprehensive way. And I think another element of gender mainstreaming that is something that's not so much talked about in the book, but something I've been working on a lot since then, is sort of, I often break it down, and even for a harder security crowd, I often break it down in this way of sort of thinking about gender mainstreaming as a strategy. What do we mean by it? Why should we do it? That's that big picture stuff. Then how gendered analysis can help you with your threat analysis. And this is the language of, you know, hard security, right? Threat analysis. But thinking about how much gendered norms and expectations impact radicalization processes, they impact recruitment practices, they impact the roles that people take up in organizations. We've done a lot of work looking at misogyny and gendered norms of far-right extremist groups and Islamist extremist groups, and sort of the expectations that they put on their own people, and how that is highly gendered in many, many, many cases. And sort of then also that helps in with an analysis of, whereas we might not think of women as being as prevalent within these organizations, that's often because we're not thinking of them and the roles that they're doing as important to those organizations. So I use this analogy with the military crowd a lot. But if you think about a military, right? In a military, there are infantry soldiers that carry the weapons that, you know, are at the front line of the fighting. But then there are logistics soldiers, and there are intelligence soldiers, and there are these soldiers that are responsible for cooking for everyone and setting up the camps. And in the military context, they're all soldiers. You would never consider the people who are, you know, cooking for all the soldiers not soldiers. They're just as much soldier as everyone else. But when we think about terrorist organizations, we don't tend to think about it that way. We tend to think about the ones wielding the weapons or at the front line of the attacks as the terrorists, and everyone else as sort of these supporting roles. And supporting often means lesser than, and in many, many minds. And there's a lot less consideration given to the importance. I mean, a terrorist organization has to be financed, they have to be fed, and often women are participating in those roles more prominently without that sort of same level of consideration of how essential those roles are to the operations of the terrorist organization. So there's a sort of a gendered analysis that can help you really assess the expanse of the threats. And then there is the sort of gendered analysis that needs to, or the gendered response development that needs to happen. So thinking about your institutional, your state, you know, your security goals, thinking about the strategic impact of your counterterrorism operations or your PCVE programs. What is the end, the big goal that you're trying to, the impact that you're trying to have? And then thinking about operational effectiveness. And this goes back to what we were talking about with thinking about sort of the impact of a military operation. What impact are you having on the ground? What future threats might you be creating for yourself if you're not considering the impacts that you're having or not being respectful of local cultural context? And sort of that operational effectiveness level. And I can make an argument to a military officer as to why gender mainstreaming would make their operation more effective. And often that argument is very much based on that effectiveness element. I don't make an argument based on the moral, you know, commitment to this is why you should do it because it's the right thing to do. I can make that argument, but I don't think that is the most effective argument always. I think it's about showing how it can make operational efforts and help reach strategic goals more effectively. This is the book. That's a QR code if anyone wants to see the book where you can purchase it. You can follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn, well, what used to be Twitter. also, I do a lot of presentations and events and stuff, so I'm happy to engage with anyone following as well.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I see we have a question from Natalia. Go ahead, Natalia.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you very much, Jessica, for a really interesting presentation. I would actually like to go back to the super important point that you made, and that's to also work in PCD programs on gender equality and expanding gender roles. And that's the point that we also make very often in our trainings. I come from UNOCT, but that's also, I feel, the point that military, but also law enforcement, they just immediately shut down and they say, well, it's too broad for where we stand. And okay, we can get the integrating gender analysis into threat analysis, but like working on gender equality, that's too much. And I get it. I mean, for a reason, the global counterterrorism strategy talks about all of a government approach, but I also do believe that it's important for all of the government to really work on this. So based on your experience and especially your background with military, do you have any practical suggestions of how to further encourage security actors, be it military or law enforcement, to actually work on gender equality and expansion of gender roles? And do you have any suggestions of how to best sell it to these actors? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's a difficult one, and sometimes it's about reading, I think, the crowd that you're speaking to. Often I have found, especially in a room full of military officers, and I think this probably holds true largely in the police arena as well, that the argument around gender equality has to be, for within the forces, having gender equality within the forces has to be made on how it would improve their operational effectiveness. So often, for example, like the police, an example would be, I was speaking with some officers from South America not that long ago, and they were talking about the drug cartel problems, right? They have obviously a problem that they're trying to deal with. They talk about their male intelligence officers. So the people who are actually infiltrating drug cartels and gathering information and bringing it back to the police to help inform how they can best operationally address the drug cartels. And they started talking to me about there was this expectation that it was too dangerous for women, but that when they did have women officers who were acting in these intel roles, and they were actually very effective in infiltrating, in the same way that we know that terrorist organizations have taken advantage of us in that way, that people don't expect as much. Their guard is not as high with women in many cases because they are women. There's an inherent, gender bias there. So they talked to me about how effective, once you get them going and talking about, okay, why should you have women? You can start to point out, okay, well, look, in this situation, what a woman officer could bring to this, intel role is perhaps very valuable to you. So you can give them an example of how it might improve effectiveness. With military, there's often an element of, I've had these conversations where I'm not a believer in female engagement teams. I am a believer in cultural sensitivity with military units. But I think taking women from military roles that they worked hard to get to and just saying you should be on this team because you are a woman is not fair, right? If they worked really hard to be a bomber or whatever it was, then maybe they don't want to be in this other team, right? You shouldn't take them just because of their female characteristics and put them on a team. But there is a really good opportunity if you develop those teams in a sensitive way to better understand the local context, to better engage in a local context. They knew in Afghanistan when they got there that they were damaging themselves by not having that front-facing, the units that could engage with the local people in a sensitive way. So there are certainly arguments that you can make about equality helping to improve operational effectiveness. Often those need to be tailored to what those officers are working on. Otherwise, they'll be like, well, that doesn't really apply to me, so why should I worry about it? But if you can tailor it to what element they are working on, I think you can often get to these really good conversations about how equality would improve. And I would warn against getting hung up on, often in security, space, women aren't just physically capable and this and that. Don't get hung up in those conversations, because ultimately that's not the point, right? In a modern military environment, which a lot of hybrid warfare is going to take place, going forward, the physical issue around special forces and this, that. It's its own thing, but it's not something, don't get hung up in that conversation. You keep it to sort of what contributions you know that people can provide. And often it's about sort of individual assessment of, look, this person is really good at this element, so therefore you should include them, you know, as an officer for this unit or whatever it might be. I don't know if that's helpful, but I hope it is.
It is, thank you. Just perhaps any words of wisdom of how to walk that line without falling into instrumentalization of women, because that's, you know, military, if they get it, they're like, oh yeah, so we'll use women for intelligence, or, you know, the community, and like there they go and run with those programs. So any experience on addressing that aspect?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's sort of, I think that's the female engagement team's argument, right? Like, oh, you're just putting them there because they're women. They're not necessarily good at that. And I think, you know, I had a colleague who's still in the military that was talking to me the other day, and he said to me, yeah, I take my female officer. He's like, I'm quite loud when I'm giving instruction, or, you know, like I'm aggressive in the way that I'm giving the instruction, but I'll take my female officers aside and give it to them in a little bit more of a gentle manner, you know? And I said to him, I said, well, look, you know, maybe some of those female officers would actually prefer the louder version, and maybe some of your male officers would prefer the quieter version, you know, and really just asking them to think through individual personal preference and individual personal response, I think helps them to think, okay, so maybe it's not because they're a man or because they're a woman, it's because of this individual preference or individual skill that they might have or ability they might have. That is very difficult in a military context, because ultimately the machine is a machine, right? You become part of the machine, you become a number. It's an environment that is antithetical to that, but it's moving in that way because militaries are getting smaller, police forces are getting smaller, there's less money, there's a need to make them more efficient. So I think you have to work on that sort of argument of using individual abilities and that are available to you, rather than lumping people in big lumps in the way that they often do.
Thank you.
I also have a question. You know, you sort of talked a little bit about the gap between practitioner and academia, but in the book you also touch on resistance from within institutions that are mandated to change, but are, you know, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how to counter that resistance of at the higher levels. Like, it's great you get buy-in from the top, but then the levels immediately underneath aren't quite so excited about it. So
yeah, it's a great question. I think often it's the mid-management level, right? That's the level that becomes the most challenging, because at the very high level of these institutions, right, they're aware of the political agreements that have been made, and that publicly they have to support those political agreements. At the lower level, you might actually be getting in a new generation of recruits that are more open-minded in this way and sort of more willing to be thinking about it that way. But it's that mid-management level that's often the most resistant, because they're grounded in the tradition of the organizations, and they want to require everyone to come through that same path that they had to come through to get to that level of authority and to that level of status within the organization. And that is really difficult. It's really difficult to combat that resistance at that level, I think. And often, I mean, I think in police departments, you see, like at the national level, the national police departments, they're pretty on board. They've got the policy in place. You know, the new recruits, maybe they're okay, but if you get to those local police departments, that's where it really becomes difficult. Why they don't want to engage in the conversation. And I think you have to go back to the basics of explaining sort of how the institution got there, so that maybe you can open the eyes of people to, this isn't just, you know, it's like the whole institutional culture that has gotten you there. But there is an element of having to address, I think, until we address that sort of hypermasculine culture of security or institutions and security environments, until, you know, boot camp trainings are not based on this sort of hypermasculine berating and racial berating of people, sort of that in and out group formation process that builds these institutions and the units within them and security spaces. Until that is changed, I think that middle management level is going to continue to be a wall of resistance that will be very difficult to get beyond, because it's cultural evolution thing that they've been brought through, and they feel that everyone else should be brought through the same path that they were to get to where they got. So I think it's about addressing that sort of cultural environment within institutions, which is a big ask. It's not something that would be easy to do, but I think if we can keep asking, and if we can keep making a case for why it's important, that eventually we might be able to get somewhere.
I'm very happy you were all able to join us. I'm very thankful to Jessica for this amazing presentation. It was excellent. And yes, and we're exactly on time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.